It is not only a pleasure to welcome Leslie to our forum, but an honor to have her as our speaker today.
Thank you.
Welcome, Leslie.
Thank you. Thank you. Hi, everyone. I'm really happy to be here. Some of you, all of you might know that I was going to be here last February, and then the weather got the best of the situation, and I wasn't able to, the flight got canceled, and long story short, I'm here now. So it took a while, but I'm very, very happy to be here. I'm very happy that the forum invited me, and thank you all for coming here and spending some time, a few hours with us today. I also know that you've had a whole series of speakers throughout the year. I wish I could have heard many of them I have heard on other occasions, and I agree with everything that's said. So I hope that I can add another layer to what you've already been thinking about and hearing and talking about, all winter long. And it has been a long winter, although a different kind of winter than certainly the last several years in this country's history. It has been quite remarkable what the changes that have gone on in this country. To think that it was not so long ago that George Bush was president of the United States. However that happened, and you all here in Florida know how that happened. But that's no longer true. That not only that man, but that way of thinking has been swept out of Washington. Unfortunately, not all of it. There are still some remnants of that around, but it has been a dramatic change. Having said that, I'll come back to this a little later about what the particular challenges for the anti-war movement are. But having said that, and I'll talk more about the Obama phenomena, the whole campaign process and the election and the inauguration, what it means for us. But let me just say one thing right up front, that as powerful and as important as his election is, our work is far from over. And in many, many ways, this is still true. In that I felt this the minute he got elected, that everything is different, but nothing has changed. Everything is different about our consciousness and about how we think about the possibility of change. But the changes haven't happened yet. So we'll come back to that. I just want you to keep that in mind as I go through my comments here. So let me say a few words here to get this going. First, what is it that we're working for? That is, are we an anti-war movement? Are we a peace movement? What's the difference? Are they the same thing? What difference does it make? And I think, in fact, we are both. I hope we are both. We are both an anti-war movement, but we're also a peace movement. And in my mind, this is how I think about the distinctions here. An anti-war movement often is focused on a particular war or a particular set of wars. And we have to be vigilant, and we have to stay focused on those realities of war. It's not just an abstract concept, right? There are real wars going on that need our attention. At the same time, though, we have to be a peace movement. We have to be a movement that not only ends a particular war or particular set of wars, but begins to chip away at the dynamics that lead us over and over again into these wars. And in that context, actually, we really must be a peace and justice movement. It's not just rhetoric, it's not just a slogan, but really, the real deal is there will not be peace unless there is justice. They must go hand in hand. And that's what our big challenge is. How do we stay focused on, how do we pay attention to a particular war that's going on and do that work in a way that is raising the bigger questions and beginning to challenge the bigger forces at play that lead us into these wars over and over again. But we would be making a terrible mistake if we shifted gears away from the particular wars and only dealt with the big picture. When your neighbor's house is burning, you don't go to them and say, would you like a fire prevention class? Right? You help them put out the fire. Right? And the fires are burning right now in many parts of the world. So we have to pay attention to that. And yet we need that fire prevention class also. That's a challenge. How do you do the immediate and the long term at the same moment? And believe me, I wish we had a formula. I wish there was a recipe for how to do that. But that's, I think, one of the biggest challenges that our movement faces, and probably many other social movements face a parallel challenge. So we must be about peace. And peace must be about more than just the absence of war and the absence of violence. It must also be about justice. And by justice, I mean equality, I mean freedom, I mean all those terms that get thrown around a lot about what this country is supposed to be all about, but we know has often not lived up to what we're supposed to be about. So that's what our work must be about. And I think that's not, as I said, not an easy challenge to combine all those layers of work at the same time. Let me add one other layer, too, when we talk about war and peace, that we also need to be very consciously working against military occupation, because military occupation is slightly different than war. It may not be that bombs are dropping, or that grenades are going off, or that people are being shot down. But by a military presence of a foreign military army occupying a nation, that has a corroding effect on the lives of people in that country. And military occupations take place in many parts of the world right now, and we have to be concerned about what we're doing and how our government is interacting with those occupations. Are we supporting them? In fact, is our role, not us in this room, but our government's role, to keep those occupations alive? And if it is, then that needs to be challenged too. So we need to have broad definitions about what we're talking about here, what our struggle is about, what our work is. Otherwise, the wars, what we think of in that more limited sense of war, are going to keep happening over and over and over again. And I've actually never been in a war zone. I've never, probably some of you have. I've never actually lived through it. I don't want to. I know enough. I don't need to do that. I know enough to know it's not good. And that's just the simplest, easiest way to say it. The horror of war and what it brings to a person, to a community, to a nation, is something that it shouldn't be just a concern of an anti-war movement or of a peace movement. That should be everybody's concern, to prevent war and to bring peace. Should and is, those getting from the should to reality is a big jump, and that's why we need a movement to make those leaps. Let me just say a few words about 3 situations that are current war and occupation situations. One, of course, is Iraq. I'm sure I don't need to tell you all here, this was a war that never should have happened. Of course, this was a war that was brought to us by a presidency that never should have happened. And it was a war based on lies. What is most interesting to me, one of the most interesting things about this war, was that many of us knew before it actually began, in the run-up to the war, that the Bush administration was lying. And many people, most of the people of the world knew that they were lying. And most of the governments of the world said, don't go to war. What was fascinating is that the United States Congress didn't understand that the Bush administration was lying, and they said, okay, go. Here's your military authorization. Here's the money you want. Go to war. I will never understand how that happened. Supposedly, smart people elected to represent us, and we knew the war shouldn't happen, said to the president, okay, maybe this isn't the best thing to do, but here's all the money you need. Go to war. They have to be held accountable too. I mean, this was not, in the most important sense of this, This was Bush's war. But it could not have happened alone. It was not only the Bush administration that made this war happen. The United States Congress has allocated over these 6 years over 600, close to $700 billion that have already gone into this war. They had some responsibility in this too. So that war is still going on. Yes, it is different than it was a year ago or 2 years ago. Yes, the number of deaths are down. It is a calmer situation, but it is still going on. Every day there are still deaths. There is still destruction. And it's not, I think, for as horrible as it is that so many young, mostly young U.S. service people have died in this war, more than 4,000, again, in a war that never should have happened, and tens of thousands have been wounded. I don't think we really know the exact number. I don't think the U.S. government wants that number to get out, to tell you quite honestly. But some of those wounds are horrendous wounds. I mean, one of the really interesting things is that in the Vietnam War, more people, the casualty figures were higher, much higher, of course, than we see now. It was like 57,000 U.S. service people died over a longer period of time also. But many of those people died from wounds that now, because of advances in medicine, people are kept alive. But they're kept alive with horrendous wounds that they will carry, and their families and their communities will carry for the rest of their lives. As horrendous as that is, as awful as that is, it pales in comparison to what the Iraqi people have suffered and continue to suffer. Estimates are, and again, unfortunately, we do not have exact figures, but from reliable sources, estimates are that at least 1 million Iraqis have died. That is in a country of 23 million people. That's a tremendously high percentage of the population. Estimates are that somewhere between 4.5 and 5 million Iraqis have been displaced. Either about 2 million are out of the country in neighboring countries, which of course creates more tension in the whole region. Those countries were not prepared to accept refugees coming in. It creates a burden in their countries and more tension in the whole region. And another 2.5 or more million internally displaced. People had to leave their homes and their communities and are living in other parts of the country, in other neighborhoods. I just saw a figure the other day. There's some 5 million, no, maybe it's 1 million, I can't remember, orphans in Iraq now. I mean, the figures go on and on and on, and we don't even have figures of how many Iraqis are living with life-changing wounds, to say nothing of the damage done to their nation. This was a vibrant nation, one of the oldest nations on the earth, right, with a highly developed systems of providing services and an infrastructure and education, advanced education. So much of that has been ruined, demolished, the infrastructure destroyed. To say nothing of unemployment and medical problems, just everything that you could imagine, that the worst of what war has to bring. Then the sad truth is that our media in this country has barely told that story. They have barely told the story of what's gone on in terms of the impact of this war, the human costs for the Iraqi people. And if we don't tell that story, who will? And then, of course, as I said, there's the economic costs of the war. Hundreds of billions of dollars already spent, and that doesn't account for the long-term costs of paying, for instance, the medical costs of all those veterans who are coming home, and all those people who might have been productive workers in the workforce who are now out of that because of their wounds. And there have been calculations that this war is going to end up costing trillions of dollars, not billions of dollars, but trillions of dollars. And again, a war for what reason? A war based on lies. And again, a war that never should have happened. So this war is not over. Now, there is some good news, of course. With the election and the presidency of Barack Obama, he has announced, just the other day, just last week, he announced a plan to end the war. The good news in that is that he has a plan. The last president didn't even want to think about ending the war. So he has a plan, and with some date specific for when combat troops will come home and when the residual troops, those other troops will be left home. The bad news is that that goes on for too long for many of us. To think of almost 3 more years of the U.S. being there, it's way, way, way too long. Now, I think we're all realistic. We know you can't bring home 160,000 troops and all that equipment overnight, but it shouldn't take 3 years. It can be on a lot faster timeline than that. So our work with Iraq is not over, even though some people think it is. And that presents a challenge to us, right? Because many people who are opposed to the war think that it's over. It's not on the front pages anymore. The casualties are down. It seems to have calmed down a little bit. And Barack Obama has announced a plan so we can relax. We can't relax. All those troops need to be brought home. And I think we have to be particularly vigilant on the question of all. While his plan includes in it the eventual withdrawal and bringing home of all the troops, we have to watch that. We have to be very vigilant about that. It'll be very easy for them to slip in to a situation where they decide, well, we need to keep 10,000 or 50,000 or whatever the numbers are for X, Y, or Z reasons. We must make sure that that does not happen. We still have troops in Korea. This is crazy, right? That this should not be, we cannot let that happen again. There must be no permanent U.S. bases left behind in Iraq. And there are something like 13 or 14 bases, U.S. bases, that have been built in Iraq since, in the course of this war. What are they going to do with all that? Are they just going to turn it over to the Iraqis or what? So we have to watch that. It's a far from settled situation. The other war I want to mention, which is a war that our anti-war movement, our peace movement, unfortunately has not paid enough attention to, and that is Afghanistan. And this is obviously a little more complicated. It's a little more complicated. It's still an horrendous situation, though, for the people of Afghanistan in particular. That's been going on even longer. That's been going on for 7.5 years. And you probably all remember the reason given that we went into Afghanistan is that we had to look for Al-Qaeda. We had to look for Osama bin Laden. Well, to tell you quite honestly, I don't get it. 7.5 years later, they can't find this guy? What is going on here? And now again, I'm not an expert on the mountainous areas of Afghanistan and the difficulties there, but our country has the most sophisticated military apparatus ever known to human history. Right? We have the most sophisticated spying apparatus and supposedly a very smart intelligence apparatus. Well, we know there's been some real problems with that, with intelligence gathering. But why are we really there? I don't think we know. I don't think we really know yet what the U.S. is trying to do, has been trying to do in Afghanistan, above and beyond trying to get Osama bin Laden. Let me just say a footnote to this, by the way. I want to make it very, very clear. I and United for Peace and Justice, we do not condone or support or applaud terrorism in any form, in any way, shape, or form. And people who commit acts of terrorism should be found and should be brought to justice. And by that I mean they should be brought into a court and they should be tried. And if they are found guilty, they should be punished. That's what justice means in the legal sense of justice. Brought to justice doesn't mean that you bomb innocent Afghani children and families. Right? That is not bringing Al-Qaeda to justice. That's a revenge. And our foreign policy should not be conducted on the basis of revenge. So again, I just want to make sure that we're very clear about this. There should be no tolerance for terrorism. That is not a way to bring about the kind of changes, as legitimate as your grievances might be. That is not a way to bring about change. And by terrorism, I mean acts of violence, including the murder of civilians, who, in the most part, have nothing to do with creating the problems that you are supposedly acting on or seeking to get redress for. So we do not support or condone terrorism. Having said that, again, we cannot support a U.S. military operation in Afghanistan that seems to go on and on with no clear goal, with no objectives, with no exit strategy, and with no success. And again, hundreds of billions of dollars being poured into that. The casualties going up and up and up. There have been more U.S. deaths in the last year or two than in the previous 5 years in Afghanistan, and it's only going to get worse. There is no reason, based on history, to believe that the U.S. military operation is going to be successful in Afghanistan. The British Empire couldn't do it, right? The Soviet Union couldn't do it, right? Nobody could do it. Why people in the Pentagon think that they can do it, aside from their arrogance, why they think they can do it when no one else in history has been able to do it, befuddles me. Our anti-war movement, our peace movement, has not paid enough attention to Afghanistan. And I think we are called upon now to focus more energy and more effort on that, partially because the new president has declared and has just recently announced that he will be expanding the U.S. military operation there. They just announced a few weeks ago plans to send 17,000 more troops into Afghanistan. From our point of view, that's going in exactly the wrong direction. Now, if you want to send 17,000 negotiators and a team of diplomats into the region without arms, without tanks, without bombers, that would be something else. Of course there are problems. Of course there are issues that we want to address, that we need to address, that we have some responsibility to address. But sending in the Marines is precisely the wrong way to go. We have to amplify and expand, and if you will, bring a surge to our diplomatic efforts. That's the way to be going. And in fact, Barack Obama has talked quite a bit. Certainly during his candidacy, he talked quite a bit about the need to expand a commitment to negotiation and diplomacy. That's what we need to be pushing him on and reminding him that that's in fact what he put forth as an alternative to the over-reliance on the military over and over again. So it is wrong what we're doing in Afghanistan, and also it doesn't work and it won't work. So why pour more billions of dollars into it? Why bring more death and more destruction into a policy that we know is not going to work? The third area I want to mention that I think we have a particular role in, which is different than the role in Iraq or in Afghanistan, is the conflict in Palestine and Israel, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And I think that we have to pay, our movement has begun to pay more attention to this over the years. But I think if nothing else, the recent events in Gaza should remind us just how awful that situation remains, how unsettled this problem is. The reports from Gaza have just been horrendous. In really just a matter of weeks, the amount of death and destruction brought to this really very tiny strip of land with 1.5 million people crammed into it are just horrendous. I'm sorry, I don't have the figures in front of me, but upwards of like 1,400 Palestinians were killed, thousands of people wounded, tens of thousands of buildings destroyed. Again, the infrastructure bombarded. And this in the context of an occupation and a policy from Israel which already was causing suffering and pain to the people of Gaza by denying the access of humanitarian aid to flow freely into that nation or into that strip of land. And that's even worse now. It not only during the bombing period were the humanitarian shipments basically cut off, but they've just let a little bit in. There's hardly enough flowing in there. So people are suffering from a lack of the most basic foods and medicines and the sustenance of life, what you need to keep, to stay alive, basically. I raise this because we, as people of this country, have to understand the role of the U.S. government in keeping that occupation of both the West Bank and Gaza, and keeping the role that the Israeli government has played that our government has made it possible for the Israeli government to carry out those atrocities. I don't know what else to call them. They are atrocities. There is a tremendous amount of money every single year, our tax dollars, that goes to the Israeli government, particularly designated for maintaining the occupations of the West Bank and Gaza. So it's not something abstract or foreign or unrelated to us. If we were to get our government to stop that flow of money, it would put a tremendous pressure on Israel to have to rethink their policy. I think at this point, virtually everybody, most people in the world, when they look at the situation, understand that there has to be a way to work out this tension and this difference. And that most probably the answer is a two-state solution. That's most probably what will work the best. That's what we need to be working toward. That's what our tax dollars should be used for, to encourage, again, a process of negotiation and diplomacy that would lead to that, where both peoples, where the Israeli population and the Palestinian population, in fact, can live in security. The occupation of the Palestinian territories has not made the people of Israel a whole lot safer. In fact, it's made their lives less safe. So it's not in the interest of the Palestinians nor of the people of Israel. And again, we don't support terrorism, whether it's directed against the Palestinians or directed against the Israelis. The shooting of rockets into Israel, that shouldn't be allowed either. That has to stop also. We can't just take one side or the other side. It all has to stop. Having said that, we do have to also understand that one side has tremendous resources. It's not exactly an equal or level playing field there. And partly it has tremendous resources because of the role of the U.S. So I want to point to those three areas, and I can't help but notice they're all in the same part of the world. That is that part of the world that we call the Middle East, right, is obviously an area of the world that our country has a strategic interest in. And part of that interest has to do with oil. Let's be clear about it. It has to do with oil. That's part of our interest in Afghanistan. It has to do with the pipeline that's going through Afghanistan, or could go through Afghanistan if they weren't in a war zone there. And this leads us, of course, directly to the question of energy. Where do we get our energy? Which I hope also leads us not too far down the road to the question of why do we need so much energy? How do we use, why are we, one country of the world, such a large consumer of the world's energy resources? And we have to think about that. It's not only a question of government policy, it's a question of what we do in our individual lives too. All that adds up. So I think that, one of the parts of the agenda of the peace and justice movement needs to be about energy and the environmental crisis. And these are all related issues. It's a big agenda. And parsing it out so that you can actually focus some creative energies and make changes, it's not, like I said before, it's not easy, but that's what we have to do. So let me talk a little bit about where we're going. I've identified three areas, three countries in the world, and three particular hotspots, if you will, and tried to place that in a bigger context. But where are we going? Let me just say before where we're going, we need to think a little bit about where we've been. And I was just thinking about this yesterday as I was coming down here. In our lifetimes, we have seen anti-war movements and peace movements be strong and be weak, come and go, if you will. There's not really like a permanent peace movement in this country. And the talk of a Department of Peace in Washington, I think it goes in the right direction here. But we have, unfortunately, found ourselves in many situations, and this was true back in 2002 again, when it was clear that the Bush administration was determined to go to war in Iraq, where we had to both do the work of trying to prevent that war and then trying to stop that war at the same time as we had to rebuild a peace movement and an anti-war movement. And that's maybe why we call it a movement, because it has its ebbs and flows, and it's stronger and weaker and bigger and smaller at different times. It's never stable. But we have, of course, during Vietnam, we had a very strong anti-war movement in this country, and then that died down. There was a pretty strong movement around Central America, right, when the U.S. was very engaged in Central America, in Nicaragua and El Salvador in particular. And we had a pretty strong movement then, and then that died down. So at times we've had different moments when we've been stronger and weaker. So in 2002, we found ourselves having to once again rebuild an infrastructure for a peace movement. At the same time, we were trying to prevent a war. That's hard, to move on both levels of work at exactly the same time. I don't know what it will take to try and solidify our movement, to build enough of an infrastructure. I'm not talking about a big bureaucracy, but enough of an infrastructure so that whatever the changes are in the world around us, we don't have to keep rebuilding ourselves each time. We can deal with the issues as they come up. So again, there's no recipe for that, there's no formula for how to do that, but I think that's one of the challenges that we have, especially in this period. So where are we with the next steps? So let me go through some of these and add one or two others too. On Iraq, as I mentioned, we have the Obama plan. We have to be vigilant on this. I think we have to keep the pressure on the White House to say, that's great, you have a plan, it's not enough, right? And we want it to happen more quickly. We want to make sure it's thorough, all the troops come home, and actually we need to add our concern about the contractors, the private contractors. There are just about as many private contractors in Iraq as there are U.S. military people. And some of those are doing operations of the military. Right? So the contractors need to come home too. And there's no accountability. As weak as the accountability in Washington and the Pentagon have been, there's no accountability when it comes to the private contractors. So all of that needs to be, the plan needs to be more comprehensive and on a much faster timeline. And we, especially those of us who feel good about the fact that Obama is in the White House, we need to go to that administration and say, we are glad you are there. We are happy about the way you talk about the future of this country. But we have this disagreement with you. We want you to be moving this agenda more quickly and more thoroughly in Iraq and bringing all those troops home. There's going to be a particular issue coming up very soon. We don't have the exact date yet, but most likely sometime in March, sometime this month, the Congress will again be asked for more money for Iraq. The figures we're hearing now is about $75 billion more. $75 billion more? Hello, isn't there an economic crisis in the country? Now that pales, of course, compared to what they've given to the banks, right? Or to the car companies, or a whole lot of other stuff. But it's another $75 billion. I think it's going to be very tough this year. We have never been able to stop the supplemental. These allocations of money. The biggest vote we got in the House of Representatives was 144 people voted against the supplemental. That's out of like 425 members of the House. So we've never been able to secure that. I think it's going to be even harder this time because Obama has announced a plan to withdraw. And the argument, of course, is that while they're there, the troops need the equipment that they need, and they need the et cetera, et cetera. So it's a challenge. How are we going to handle this? I don't know. Can we get maybe some amendments attached to that? And get an amendment perhaps that says the timeline will be shorter to bring the troops home. And not at the end of 3 years, but at the end of this year, all the troops will be home, or whatever. So that may be one strategy that we try and develop. And then, of course, as I said before, we do have to be vigilant on the issue of permanent bases. Even though he has said that there will be no forces left behind at the end of these 3 years, we have to be vigilant on that and make sure that there are no permanent forces or bases, left in Iraq. Afghanistan, again, I've already raised that as a critical concern that we have to take up. The Obama plan is going in the wrong direction. 17,000 more troops now. What is it going to be in 6 months or a year? Is it going to be another 50,000 or another 100,000? And these things have a way of growing. We need to be encouraging a diplomatic surge, not a military surge. We also, though, have a piece of work within our communities of educational work. Most people in this country actually right now support the president's plan to send in more troops to Afghanistan. We need to do the very basic educational work, and I should just say that United for Peace and Justice, I'm very proud of this. We have a working group that has really put a lot of effort into developing resources and fact sheets and articles that people can use to do that educational work in their own communities. If you go to our website, unitedforpeace.org, you can access all that information, all those resources. And again, the supplemental will come up. Actually, one interesting thing is that we could have, in these past 6 years, been linking our work around Iraq and Afghanistan a lot more easily than one might have imagined. Because every time the request for supplemental funds came up in the Congress, it was always supplemental funds for Iraq and Afghanistan. Those monies were always voted on together. And that will happen again this time. Again, it's a little tricky because we don't believe Congress is going to be so interested, they're going to be even less interested in not providing that money. That doesn't mean we shy away from a fight, right? Obviously, if we shied away from a fight, we wouldn't be here today. We don't do that. Again, as I mentioned, Israel and Palestine, we need to, I think it's very good that the second visit, the second trip that the new Secretary of State made was to that region. That sends a good sign, and the Bush administration waited to the last year out of 8 years to try and put any energy, and then they hardly did anything on trying to help resolve that situation. All they did was kind of rah-rah for the Israeli government. When the Israeli government was bombing Lebanon, it was 2 years ago, 2.5 years ago, there was not a word of criticism from Washington. Right. Same with Gaza now. The Bush administration basically said, well, there's nothing we can do. Let it go. So hopefully now, within the first month of the new administration, the new Secretary of State went to the region and has spoken both with Israelis and with Palestinians. This is hopefully a new beginning. We hope that will play out that way. We also have a new opportunity, I think, largely because of the economic crisis that the country is in, to raise in a way that we haven't for many, many years. And this is part of the agenda, should be part of the agenda of the peace movement. And that is the military budget in its totality. It's not just a question of supplementals for this war or that war or this occupation or this military adventure, but the whole military budget. It is a tremendous expenditure every single year. Hundreds of billions of dollars poured into the military. It is the most wasteful spending, right? It does not produce jobs. If the equivalent amount of money went into education and housing and health care, not only do our communities need education and housing and health care, to say nothing of everything else, they also create many more jobs for people. So the fact that it is wasteful is one part of it. The fact that it's also goes into an operation that is the Pentagon, which ends up then carrying out these wars, it's also wrong. It's wasteful and wrong. And there's an opportunity, I think in large part because of the economic crisis, where people are wondering, how are we going to get, I don't know, how are we going to get out of this economic crisis? Where do the changes need to be made? Where are the openings for rethinking how our economy works? And one place is in the military budget. And in fact, Barney Frank, a representative from the Boston area, has said, and he's quite serious about this, he's pushing for a 25% cut in the military budget. That would be, I'm sorry, again, I don't have the exact figures with me, but it'd be hundreds of billions of dollars saved. Would that change the kind of operational definition of what the U.S. military does? No, it wouldn't. But it would begin to open up. If there was a serious battle being waged in this country around the military budget, It would have to open up a more public discussion about what the role of the U.S. military is. It just goes hand in hand. Why are we spending the money at all? And the more that those questions get open, the more likelihood there is for us to push a real peace agenda. It's not going to happen overnight. Barney Frank is hoping, and there's kind of a growing movement for calling for a 25% cut in the military budget in the 2010 federal budget. That would be a tremendous victory. I don't know if that's going to happen that quickly. And if that happens, we can't be satisfied. I don't mean to sound like we're greedy here, right? But a 25% cut is just the bare beginning of what a struggle should be around the military budget. And then there is the parallel struggle. It's not only about cutting the money going into the military, it's also about increasing the money that goes into our communities. Because there is no automatic guarantee that less money going into the military means more money going into social programs. There is no guarantee on that. We are going to have to struggle for every dime. As you all know, we already have to struggle for every dime, for health care, for education, for infrastructure, for the environmental work that needs to be done. Every single dime has to be fought for. But at least if there's a reduction in military spending, there's some argument that could be made, well, we're saving money there, let's use it someplace else. So and let me just say, actually, let me throw in here too, one of the big challenges in all this when it comes to spending is the role of the privately owned corporations. That's who makes money off of all this stuff. It's not the generals and the Pentagon who are making a fortune. They're not making a fortune. I'm sure they make nice salaries, whatever. They may set bad policy with the money that they get to use. But who's actually making a profit? It's the privately owned corporations that make the submarines and make the uniforms and make the bullets and make the boots and make the tanks and make the guns and everything else. And that's a very, very, very big challenge to us, that at the bottom, at the base of all this, are those privately owned corporations that make the money. And if they don't think that they're going to make money in housing or in education or in health care or whatever, then they're going to be less likely to invest in those areas. So we have a big struggle in this country ahead of us. Hopefully we're going to have a big struggle over privatization and the ways that those privately owned corporations have so much control and influence and power in the overall structure and running of our economy. And a lot of that is being opened now for people. I mean, the talk about nationalizing the banks, who ever thought that at this point in this country's history, that would even be a topic for discussion? Should the banks be nationalized? I don't think it's going to happen, but the fact that it's even being talked about opens up discussion. Well, if the banks should be nationalized, well, what about the electricity? Right? Shouldn't everybody have access to electricity? Let alone health care. Let's not get started on health care. Now, we know Obama's going to open up, he had this summit the other day about health care. And it seems pretty clear to me that he is committed to doing whatever he can to make change in the healthcare system of this country. I don't think he's going to go far enough. I think he's got a too limited a view. He knows it's rotten. He knows it's not working. He knows people are suffering. And it's not just the people without health insurance. Even people with health insurance aren't getting the kind of health care they need as quickly and as thoroughly as we all need it. And again, what is one of the problems there? What is the biggest problem? It's that private profit the dynamic that unfolds, where the insurance companies have such a hold over the healthcare delivery system because they're making money on it. They're not even providing the healthcare, right? They're providing the insurance. I mean, I'm sure many of you know this from your own experience a lot more than I do about how messed up the healthcare delivery system is. So it's good. Again, there's good news here that Obama had a summit the other day to talk about the healthcare system. But it was a fight. There was a struggle waged to get two people into that summit who support a single-payer healthcare system. And one was a member of Congress. and he had a fight to get in. John Conyers, right? And the other is the president or the chair, I forget what his title is, of Physicians for a National Healthcare Program. I forget the title of the organization. But, you know, a major national organization of physicians. They had a fight to get into that. And the Obama folks have said that single payer is off the table. Now, why it should be off the table, I don't understand, right? Shouldn't everything be open for discussion? How does that happen? It's going to happen because we push and insist. And I think it's similar to, I raise it because I think there are similar forces at play when we're talking about the military budget. And it has to do with private ownership and private profit. And until we get to that, we're not going to be able to solve so many of these other pieces that we're talking about. Again, I do think that with this economic crisis, as horrible as it is, the economic crisis, and a lot of people are suffering, and there's going to be more suffering over the course of this next year or two, it also provides an opening. There is, if you will, almost a silver lining, and that is this opening that people are questioning, well, how does this economy work, right? And how could it be that these people on Wall Street, they are so arrogant, they are so out of touch, they earn so much money, they are bailed out, and they're still, you know, using these, you know, chauffeured limousines and their private jets and all of this. I mean, it's quite phenomenal that these people don't have a little humility, at least to get out of the public spotlight a little bit with all their wealth and arrogance. Anyway, so let me shift gears a little bit here and begin to wrap this up. I want to talk a little bit about what all of this in the context of, and I made some references already to the Obama presidency. I'm sure many of you too, if not all of you, watched as much as I could every step of the way of this election. It was phenomenal to see what happened in this country. First of all, a few things to mention. First of all, we ended up with a president who had in his background a community organizing experience. And he was able to take that community organizing experience, that basic, you know, walk through your neighborhoods, knock on doors, talk to your friends and neighbors. He was able to combine that with the new technologies, the internet technologies in particular. And his campaign was successful not because it relied on one or the other, but because it combined both, which is a tremendous lesson as organizers, as activists, as people commit to social change that we have to pull from, right? That you have to be able to take the tools that you have, that you know from years and years of experience can work. That is the community organizing approach, and balance that with new ideas, new approaches, new skills and technologies that come along. It's not either or, we have to use both. Anyway, through his campaign, he was able to tap into, I think, a few things. And obviously, over time, many books will be written about all this. Much analysis will be done. But my reading of it is this, is that he was able to tap into both people's real disgust at what had gone on over the last 8 years, even if they weren't articulate about that, even if they weren't taking action about that. All of the horrors of the last 8 years, and Iraq was just the tip of the iceberg in terms of what George Bush had done to this country. He was able to, his campaign was able to tap into some of the people's frustration and disgust and horror with them, and at the same time help instill or help people find their own commitment to change based on a belief that their involvement can make a difference. And this is a tremendous thing that we have to keep in mind. If people do not believe that their involvement will make a difference, then they can have all the analysis of what's wrong and stay home. Right? They have to be able to know that their involvement makes a difference, that it's worth putting in the time and the effort and the hours and the energy to a social change movement. Otherwise, why do, you know, I might as well spend an afternoon at the beach, right? Or read to my kids, right? Or read my book myself, whatever. Or volunteer at the local hospital or library, right? Why be a social change activist if it's just like hitting your head against the wall? You have to believe it's going to lead to something. Obviously, the fact that he won reinforced that millions of people and millions of young people got involved for the first time. And that sense of that so much was wrong, that action needs to be taken, and that my involvement made a difference. That's what I was saying before, that everything has changed, that everything is different, right? That people believe that they have a sense of hope and a sense of possibility, not just that other people doing something will create the change, but my involvement will help create the change. That is a critical element that we've got to hold on to. The other thing, though, that I want to say is that the title of this talk was about mobilizing for peace and justice. But the other thing that I want to remind us about, it's also about organizing. That our movement has been very good about mobilizing people, which has basically been finding the people who have been against the war and getting them out onto the streets and getting them to write letters to the editor or to lobby their members of Congress or whatever, getting them to take action. What we have been weak on, and what the Obama presidency and his victory reminds us about, is that the organizing piece of it is absolutely critical. That even with people who agree with you, you have to talk to them. You have to talk to your neighbors. You have to talk to people in your community to get them involved. And that old kind of, just hitting the pavement and doing that old-fashioned organizing is still as relevant and maybe even more relevant than it's ever been. And our movement needs a healthy dose of that organizing to, again, not only end a war in Iraq or a war in Afghanistan or an occupation in the Palestinian territories. We need to build, through our organizing and our mobilizing, a peace and justice movement that can tackle all the kinds of issues I've laid out. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
How can you say Iraq was a functioning country under the tyrannical repression of Saddam Hussein?
Right.
Wasn't it necessary to capture him?
Well, I think it's true that let me put it this way, I'm glad I didn't have to live in a country where Saddam Hussein was in charge, right? This is not my idea of a good leader, to put it mildly. But Saddam Hussein, the time that he was in power there, was not the whole history of Iraq. Iraq goes back centuries. That was the cradle of civilization, right? The Tigris, Euphrates rivers, hello, right? That's the cradle of civilization. So there was a long history in Iraq way before Saddam Hussein came to power. And by the way, how did Saddam Hussein came to power? And what role did the U.S. have in that? Right? Let's not forget that, right? So that's one thing, that long history. Second thing is that, like, as I said, I'm glad I didn't have to live under his regime. Having said that, while he was in charge, the schools were working, the hospitals were working, people were going to work, they had access to electricity. Yes, there were gross violations of basic civil rights and human rights, but the whole infrastructure wasn't in collapse, right? The basic functions of society were functioning. And then third, as horrible as any country's leader might be, is that our job to send in the Marines to take them out? I don't think so. I don't think that's the way you deal with that. We wouldn't like that if a foreign army invaded us to get rid of George Bush, even though we would have liked to get rid of George Bush. That would not be the way to deal with it.
This is a lament.
A lament, okay.
I've stood in a vigil every week.
Right.
I've signed petitions. I've marched in D.C. and New York. I've written and called my reps in Congress. I've posted my concerns on change, government, and still the war goes on.
Right.
What really works?
Right. Well, that's an excellent question. And if I knew what really worked, I probably wouldn't be here today. I'd be out doing it. Although this is part of what really works, is talking to people. I don't think there's any one thing that really works. It's the combination and an accumulative effect. And as frustrating and as difficult as it can be to go to the weekly vigils, and I applaud those of you who do that, and you should know you're not alone. In hundreds of places around this country, there have been weekly vigils on the war in Iraq since the war began, and some in weather a lot worse than you get here. I've heard reports of places, in the northern part of the country, in the middle of a blizzard, 4 people are out at their weekly vigil. It's quite remarkable. But it all adds up. And sometimes when you're in your activity, you don't feel, you're not experiencing the fact that it's going on all around the country. And that while you're doing the vigil, someplace else they're doing a vigil, and someplace else they're writing a letter to the editor, and someplace else they're meeting with their member of Congress, and that it all adds up. And as bad as the war in Iraq has been, and as bad as the Bush administration had been, imagine what it might have been like had we not been out there. I mean, things actually could have been worse, right? They could have, for instance, started a war with Iran. And that situation's not settled yet either. But I do believe the fact that there has been a strong anti-war movement these last 6 years put a stop on the Bush administration from going into Iran. That's a victory. And sometimes it's hard when something doesn't happen, right, because of the work you're doing, it's hard to claim that as a victory, right, because it didn't happen, right? So it's hard to do that. But I think that we have to keep in mind that what we're doing is part of something bigger than our own selves and our own groups. The other thing I should just say in this regard has to do with the Obama presidency. Again, however it's going to play out in terms of what he does with Iraq and Afghanistan and other parts of the world, the way he first set himself apart from the other candidates, certainly in the primary season, was to say he was against the war in Iraq. Now, he knew that he could do that because of the large, widespread sentiment against the war in this country. That sentiment grew partially because, of course, of the reports of what was going on in Iraq, and people could see how stupid this war was, how crazy it was, but also because of the work that you all have been doing, that people around the country are doing. We actually laid a foundation that he was able to move into and take advantage of, in the best sense of that word, to build his campaign. We actually, I think, as an anti-war movement, as a peace movement, need to hold him accountable to that his presidency is in part, not totally, but in part, it happened because of the anti-war movement and because of the work that we were doing.
Before the first vote that was taken.
That's right.
Up in 2002.
That's right. And let me just say that it was an anti-war demonstration in Chicago that invited him to speak at it. So before the war began, where he was still a senator in the state senate in Illinois, and he was able to publicly say, I oppose this war. He could refer back to that as a credential, right, as being legitimately against the war. That happened because there was an anti-war movement that gave him a platform to speak from. So we have to take some credit for opening up that kind of space for an Obama presidency to flourish, for this campaign to flourish, and for him to win. Now, again, we have to go back to him and say, remember us, right? We're still here. Our commitments to ending this war and preventing other wars are still as strong. We want you to act on what we know you know in your heart of hearts is the right thing to do. And we need to push him in that direction.
On behalf of the forum, Leslie,
thank you.
It is so wonderful to hear you speak.
Thank you.
You have the facts, you listen, you answer. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.